Hello, thank you all for joining. I'm Maxwell Summerfield from Citycom. I will be the moderator for this and the future sessions. This is the first in a series of LinkedIn Live events that we plan to do monthly. We're going to help educate on some of the challenges in the financial services markets. Some housekeeping. We're on a live session here and you'll notice you're all on mute. If you want to ask any questions, we have a comments section on the right-hand side. Please use this. We will attempt to answer these within the 30-minute confines of our session. If we don't get the chance, we will get back to you after the event. Citycom have been around for 10 years operating in the financial services markets. Our heritage is in trader voice and voice quality. More recently, we've been involved in the analysis of voice, but also video. The topic we're going to discuss today is voice assurance. What we're going to cover is what is it, what it does. We're actually going to change this to what should it do. Why is it so important? Let me introduce you to Mark Whiteman, the CEO of Citycom.
Hi there.
I'm going to ask him to give us Citycom's thoughts on voice assurance. So Mark, what do you see voice assurance as?
Thanks, Max. And welcome to everybody. Looking forward to today's event and also to a series of these, and would welcome anybody out there, either who's watching it live or subsequently in the recording, to provide us with any feedback as to what they'd like to see and any topics they'd like us to cover within the confines of what we can do. So let me address your question. First of all, quite a wide topic, voice assurance. Yeah. From our point of view, having kind of been around this space now for 10 years, I think it breaks into two distinct pillars. Yeah. The first pillar is really operational checks and technical checks. So that is looking at the whole voice estate, yeah, right the way from the telephony and the capture area, right the way through to the recorders. Yeah. And as we know now, there's many different systems and different modalities that are being used for people to voice communicate. Yeah, but the first thing is that, you know, it's essential that that technology and all the operational end-to-end process is working. Yeah. So without a shadow of a doubt, there's that one element, which is the pillar. Yeah. The second, which I think is often forgotten, is really the accuracy and the quality of the actual data. Yeah. So it's not just of whether or not the technology is up and running and whether there's green lights flashing on the boxes, but actually the data that's being used and recorded, yeah, is essential. Yeah. And that's the bit that really is the acid test. Yeah. That's the bit that if it's being done for regulatory compliance and these kind of things, that's the key. It is your data there. So you've got technology.
Yeah.
And is it running? Yep. And then you've got the actual data, and is it present, and is it accurate, and is it correct? Yep. The other aspect that I would say is important to consider is there's voice assurance in the here and now. So that's what's happening on a daily basis, either near real time or end of day. What happened in that voice estate, that end-to-end process right now, yeah, and review as quickly as possible. But as we all know, particularly in the financial services sector, there's an awful lot of archived and legacy data out there. And more challenging is how do you assess and work out of all that old legacy data, what of it is actually good, what's bad, what's usable and not usable. So there's an application also within voice assurance to perhaps have a look back situation as well as a real here and now. So kind of a bit of a couple of dimensions there, two pillars here, right now, yeah, and then the look back.
No, that's good, and that's a good theory of voice assurance. So let's uncover that in some more detail. From your experience, what are you kind of really seeing in terms of what voice assurance is?
So it's been a journey, both for us and I think for the marketplace in terms of voice. If we go right the way back to the origins of it, you know, you said our heritage. You know, organisations in financial services were asked, shall we say, made to do voice recording from a regulatory compliance point of view. Yeah. That probably goes back a decade or two now. So it's a fairly well-established historic driver that's made people record their voice communications. And there's been some interesting challenges that we've seen along the way around both the operational and the technology and then the data. So what have we seen? We've seen everything in the operational environment creating data inaccuracies.
Yeah.
So from a procedural operational point of view, perhaps not people's names and the way that they are configured on systems lining up. You know, is it max.summerfield at Citycom, or is it Maxwell, or is it m.summerfield? So there's been a lot of data inaccuracies in terms of actually how all of the different systems, these disparate systems, have actually been administered. Yeah. So it kind of sticking with the theme of operational and technical, there's been a lot of data inaccuracies, which has created a load of problems. Yeah. We've also seen what I would describe as configuration creep. You know, technology, whether they be the telephone systems or whether they be the recorders, time and time they get tweaked, they get changed, they get upgraded, and the configuration of those just slightly changes a bit. So consequently, you get a lot of inconsistency, which creates, at the end of the day, some data inaccuracies.
And everybody has their own way and they want to configure things, and we see that all the time.
Absolutely.
And then they move on.
And it goes on. Yeah. The other thing I've seen is certainly initially the walk the floor type testing of the operation. Is the technology working? Was initially quite widely used, but because of cost savings and cost cuts, the ability to do manual checking has been clipped by any of the big organizations, and therefore it moved from being quite a comprehensive assurance wrapper that was delivered manually to more of a test it, dip in and dip out. So there's been a manual walk the floor and quality testing that used to be quite strong and now is less strong. Also, the systems largely have been built, bought, configured based on a cost driver rather than on a quality or a regulatory driver. That's not necessarily anyone's fault. It's always people looking to save costs, but things like we've seen not recording in 2-channel stereo has affected the quality. Compressing audio files when they are archived, that does cause a problem when you're trying to bring them back to life and use them. Yeah. So really, from an operational technology point of view, they're the kind of lessons that we've seen. From a quality point of view, quite dramatic actually. What we've seen, particularly since the highlight of this market has been on investigation, and that is the loss of recordings. Yeah, the significant number of recordings that are either driven by investigation or by litigation. Yeah, when actually go back into it, either the call never got to the recorder, so there's no record of the instance at all, or the actual recording file is not there. Yeah, or the metadata is incomplete, so you can't find it. So what we saw from a quality point of view over the years is quite a lot of redress challenges that have happened. Yeah, so I think they're really the main items that we've seen on the journey that would say, okay, there's the theory of what does good quality assurance look like, or good voice assurance look like, and these are some of the things we've seen along the way since we've been out there in the market.
Thank you for that. So let's kind of move on to sort of the second point that we were going to cover today, which was what it does, which we're actually changing to what should it do. What if you are looking for a voice assurance program, what does good look like?
Okay, so I'll stick to the same kind of theme in terms of the structure. So if you look at it, I think the first thing is that one of the things that stands out to me is that a near real-time or as close to real-time monitoring of what's going on and getting in control is a must now. Yeah, for a number of reasons that I'm sure we'll discuss perhaps a little bit later. The drivers for not being in control are more painful than being in control. So the first thing I would say is there needs to be a comprehensive near real-time monitoring capability, across what I defined as those two pillars. So what does that mean if we drill into a little bit more detail? Yeah. So in terms of kind of the monitoring of the actual operations and technology, you've got to have the ability to understand, are all your systems up? Before people come into work in the morning, you've got to know that the telephone systems are working. You've got to know that they're connected to the right recorder. You've got to know that the whole thing end to end is working and all the green lights are flashing where the green lights should be flashing. That includes all of the areas of that technology, which include networks, etc. And there are a number of tools that are out there that can do that. And it's not always as easy to have one tool. Yeah.
Especially when people are now working from home as well, being able to check that connectivity is not as easy as it was, I guess, when it was in the offices.
I think your point is valid, and that is, what we've seen is this latest situation of remote working, work from home, has exaggerated and put even more pressure onto the systems and broadens the systems that now need to be encompassed in voice assurance. It used to be quite simple. It was a telephone system, it was a turret, and it was a recorder. Well, now we've got mobile devices, we've got Zoom, Teams, whatever going on. So I think there's a whole point there that this is kind of sits under, and it's broad as well as you've got to monitor it. But there's no doubt that what does good look like? It looks like a good monitoring system. Yeah. However, the second thing that we must have, is you must monitor actually what has been recorded and captured. Yeah. And be able to do that again in near real time is essential. So what I mean by that is, you've got to be able to identify, did a call get to the recorder? Yeah. We call that telephone system reconciliation, but it's looking at whether or not a handset was picked up or a call took place. Yeah. And did it actually get to the recorder? Yeah. So that sounds quite simple, and to a lot of people sounds pretty obvious, but it needs to be checked. You need to be able to do that. Yeah.
Absolutely.
The second is, as a consequence of that, is the recording actually present? Is there an actual example of a recording there? And if it is there, is it of an appropriate quality? And regardless of what lens you're looking at on this, it's got to be validated that you're there. And the closer that you can get to doing that in near real time, clearly it's most important. Yeah. I think apart from the two pillars, I would say what does good look like is there's some general must-haves.
Yeah.
Yep. The first is in today's modern world, it's got to be automated. Yep. All these processes, all of these tools, all of these systems, it's got to happen with minimal or zero manual input. Yeah. The days of lots of technical engineers walking around trading floors or banks or insurance call centers, and doing manual testing, it's just not viable anymore. It's not viable from a cost point of view. It's not viable from a work point of view. Let's face it, we've done some clever things with technology over the last 20 years. We should be able to automate some of the monitoring of the stuff we talked about today. So that's the first thing. Yeah. The other thing is, as you've mentioned and as we talked about, it's now a lot more of a diverse set of modalities, lots more different capture telephony systems. Yeah. And if we just restrict this to voice assurance, which we are, you've got to be able to have a single set of tools that can operate across vast different numbers of modalities, technologies, vendors, recorders, and everything in between. Yeah. And not only now different vendors and modalities, but different operational models on premise, in the cloud, and so on and so forth. So you've got to be able to have something that can do that, and it can plug into, or it can work with all of that. So it needs to be pervasive across everything. Otherwise, you're going to end up with voice assurance tools for every different item that you've got. Yeah.
And there's more coming. There's more technologies out there that we haven't even seen yet that are also going to need to sit in the same bucket.
So I think that means that really it's about, if you go back to the model that we said, you've got to have something that can work across everything. It's got to be capable of everything. And therefore that's challenging when you're monitoring technology. It's less challenging when you're monitoring the data. Yeah. Okay. The second element of what we talked about, which is the voice quality aspect of it, is the file present. What's the quality of that file? Is it usable? Is it transcribable, for example? Yeah, that has to be a data play. Yeah, and I think this is where it's an important fracture point for me. The domain of this has been very much seen as the telecoms environment. Yeah, whereas actually the telecoms environment is very probably au fait and okay with dealing with the technology and other green lights flashing. But actually, the second part is a data play. It's about data mining. It's about understanding the data that you've captured. That is the regulatory requirement for most people. Some other things I think that also are important to mention as general rules of what good looks like in voice assurance. Yeah. The first is I think it's important that there's a tool or tools that are independent. Yeah. Most organizations want to be able to look at something and say, this is a fair and equitable view of what's going on, because it's highly risk if you get it wrong. So it needs to be very much an independent view. And then something that frankly, I haven't seen being focused on, but needs to be a must, is what I would call the Uber factor. Yeah. And that is, it needs to be very, very simple, to deploy. And very, very easy to use. And particularly when it comes to the data mining, there's a plethora of information that you can gather from all of these systems. And the amount of data there you can just get lost in. All you need to be able to is to cut through that and get right to the nub of it and understand, do you have a problem? Where is that problem? And how do you then remediate on that problem? And deal with the situation. So again, I think they're the general kind of rules of thumb. You've got the two pillars, so the monitoring of the operational and technical, and then you've got the data analysis. They're two things that you must have. And again, like I mentioned before, I think you've got the what's going on here and now, and also you need to have the ability to actually characterize or categorize, should I say better, your archive. Most people, most organizations are either considering, what do they do with an archive of data? Do they bring it and put it into a new recorder? Most people are thinking about new recorders, whether they be cloud-based or whatnot. How do you decide of that archive what you bring back? And again, the same processes and the same types of theories work on looking at old data as they are in data that was recorded yesterday. And I think everybody in the industry has always accepted, certainly since the sort of late 2000s, and the kind of crash situation and the investigations and the pain that was caused as a consequence in the industry, that looking back at data and it being incomplete and not easy to access, and suddenly embarrassingly saying we don't have it, is something that really must be avoided. And with tools that are effective and efficient, that can be and should be achieved.
Absolutely, and it starts to make sense on what some of those use cases are there. So you've got sort of your look back, which is what's happened, and you can't really do anything about that now. It's just we can look at the data and you can start to understand what's there of what has been there. But actually capturing it as a monitoring ongoing, you can start to pick up those before you end up with a lot of issues down the line.
Okay, great.
So that's good. So let's move on to sort of the last point that we had here, which is why is it so important, voice assurance?
Okay, that's a good question, and it links nicely to what you were just saying there, really. There's no doubt that there's a number of drivers that are pretty obvious. So if we should exclude the most obvious one, which is well trodden, which is fines, improper record keeping, incorrect record keeping, that's been done to death in terms of people talking about it. So it's obvious that if you don't do this right and you're found wanton, it's going to cost you money. But actually, we don't necessarily see that as the major issue. I think the extra work that is created by having problematic data and then having to remediate it is something that we see is hugely painful. So if I talk what through that means, if, for example, you're vulnerable or at risk because you are not in control of your voice assurance, and then some form of investigation or litigation takes place, that's often the catalyst for this. And it's a sleeping devil, isn't it? You've got a situation where it goes, well, let's just hope that we've got everything, all the lights are flashing, it should be good, we're good to go. And then somebody from legal or somebody from the regulator asks a question, and all of a sudden it comes down like a deck of cards. Can't find the files, they're missing, and it kind of snowballs. There's a fine, but actually the operational cost to distract people that have got business as usual day jobs to start scurrying around trying to find this data that's very difficult to find. We've seen it in spades everywhere we go. And there's, as you said earlier, it's kind of unavoidable for the look back,
Yep.
But my view would be, don't compound the problem, get in front of it now. And I'll come on to that point in terms of the cost element in a minute.
Yeah.
So I think the extra work that it creates and the knock-on effect of that extra work is something that, if you were to ask any banks, and we're talking to a number of them now that are in the middle of that, they would far sooner avoid. The second point is, once it's accepted that you have a problem, the actual urgency to remediate becomes kind of irrational. You have to rush solutions in. You have to patch things up. You have to throw money at it and resources at it to try and get it fixed, but you never actually get in front of it. So to be honest with you, fixing it properly and getting in front of it is a great kind of reason to go to sleep at night. Because you're not going to have to worry about this issue. And we again see so much emergency remediation taking place that probably outweighs the cost of a fine. And that's going to be more costly than the fine. So there's this urgent remediation that needs to be avoided. And then we move down the line a bit. And this is one thing that I think we've seen as well, is this has been seen very much the domain of the technical voice teams. Voice assurance. Well, it's got the word voice in it, so why would it not be? And it revolves around technology that largely the voice technical folks buy. But actually, more and more, the voice data, those voice communications, recordings, and metadata is seen as an immensely valuable asset. And they're valuable not only to do what the regulatory requirements say around surveillance and the checking and ensure that people are doing things right, but as you've mentioned before, now that you've got remote working, conduct risk, people's health, are all things that voice can help feed into. So it's valuable data. So why does that mean voice assurance is important? Well, if you're capturing or not capturing the data that you're expected to, you can't feed it downstream. You can't feed it into these systems, and these systems are expensive. These surveillance systems are expensive. They're expected to feed in data from voice. The financial services institutions have invested heavily in them. They've manned and tooled them up, and they're expecting to get results from them. And largely speaking here, if the voice isn't there, you can't analyze it. So it starts with voice assurance, but the downstream effect is immense. The other point, which is kind of aligned to that, is frankly, how do you know that the vendors that you've got, whether they be your telephony system vendors, your turret vendors, your recording vendors, how do you know whether or not they're actually performing and they're doing what you want them to do? I think we saw a perception that everything was compliant just because there's a green light flashing. Hasn't always been the case. And I'm not here to call any vendors out. All I'm saying is that it is the financial services organisation's responsibility to be compliant, and it's their responsibility to ensure that the data is present and correct. And if any of their technology isn't doing it, how do you know how to remediate it? So, one of those drivers has got to be able to understand the situation with that audio and remediate it very quickly. So the last 2 points that I've said there, which is making sure that the data is good before you feed it down the line and proactively managing, your vendors, are two things that put you in front of the game, rather than just being behind the game. So, as I said, without the obvious kind of crass answer of, well, you can avoid fines, voice assurance is essential for all of those points, I think.
No, absolutely. That's good. So it looks like we've had a couple of questions come in, Mark. One was from David Cowland, and I'm just going to read it out to you because we have a couple of minutes just before we finish. What differences have you seen across regions in terms of approach and specific needs, i.e. between North America, Europe and Asia? And is that causing issues for global companies in meeting disparate needs?
That's a great question, David. And frankly, at a high level, I haven't seen a great deal of difference yet. I've seen a difference in people's attitudes towards what they must do from a regulatory point of view. Because things like retention periods are different. But actually, most people fall into the trap of assuming that voice assurance is just out of the box. I think a better answer, David, would be I've seen the direction of travel by organisations driven by who's hottest in the kitchen as being the most thing. So who gets caught first? Yeah. And once you get a fine or you get the regulators or a litigation situation into you, that's the driver for voice assurance more than perhaps culturally anything. And what we're talking about here, just to be sure, to kind of answer David's point, we're not talking about what's on the recordings. We're just talking about the quality of the recordings, the data. Is it present? I think I'd answer the question different, David, if you were talking about what's the attitude towards surveilling that data. Yeah. Okay. But from a data point of view, no, I think there's work to be done across the globe.
No, thank you for that. And we do have a couple of more minutes, so let's answer the question from George as well. What have you seen with regards to trends of capture, encryption, and storage of recordings in the cloud for regulated vertical markets?
Yeah, over the last 10 years, a significant change. When I first started to talk to the banks about this whole piece, the cloud was definitely seen as the C word. None of the banks were in the slightest bit perturbed about taking anything off premise, and I think there was a number of drivers for that. The movement of an understanding that it's just more effective, more efficient, speedier, consistent to be done in the cloud is a direction of travel that I saw the banks taking carefully. We call it, if you go on our website, we call it the digital journey. Yep. That digital journey is just being given a firework up its rear, but called the pandemic. Yep. Yeah. So the move to moving and processing data and having these sorts of tools and all of the data in a cloud environment, has just been exaggerated because everybody's at home and not so much in the office. And the tools that people are starting to use are cloud-based. Telephony systems are now becoming cloud-based, not premise-based. I know there's still movement on that, but you look at the use of Zoom and Teams, etc., and it's all cloud. So why wouldn't you take the data in the cloud, leave the data in the cloud, process the data in the cloud, analyze the data in the cloud, and just log into the cloud? So I see a huge direction of travel to that, and a movement of some of the big banks quicker than I've ever seen them move before.
No, thank you for that. So Mark, thank you for your input. Thank you everyone also for attending the session. The session has been recorded, so this will be posted out on LinkedIn. If you want to rewatch any of the points, but also share this with any of your colleagues, please do so. We'll be summarizing the points from the event as well, so that'll be coming out in the next couple of days. So please follow us on LinkedIn and look for that. For any questions, other questions, we can take those offline with anybody else who may have those. Please, again, just reach out. The next event in the series will be the 16th of March, so we're going to be doing these monthly. That'll be coming out on LinkedIn shortly. We will invite everybody who was attending this session to that, and if you would like to share it with anybody else, please also do that. Again, have a great rest of your day. Thank you.